Virginia sits at the top of the South and the bottom of the North. So for a long time, the city didn't have its own identity. We've heard stories from Baltimore, Atlanta, DC, and the list goes on. Most of our city's history is lost in graveyards or locked away in a prison. So I don't tell you these stories to glorify the street life. I want the youth of the day to understand who their fathers were, their mothers' fathers were. And we today are descendants of those stories. So if you're a Richmond native, this is what you come from. Because there's a time in history where the streets was saw as the only way out for us, to us, especially when something has kept you fed, protected, warm, and alive. Because we all have an instinct to survive. And during these times, everything was about survival. Richmond at War, 1990.
I want my bitch, say hi to the clique. We eat the most with a job or a wrist. I really got motion, I'm young and I'm lit. These niggas be trolling, they never on shit. I heard them rumors get off my dick. He claim he fucking, but he never hit.
Fast forwarding to the end of the month, it's the day of March 31st, 1988. On this day, Lloyd G was to tell Judge Ruby about the entire altercation between Rakie and Herbert Cunningham. Also in the courtroom was an alleged male friend of the family, and Woody, who was also in the room, identified that man as none other than Carlton Brown. There were questions to why he was even there, most likely to identify the person who's currently snitching on his little bro. Now, as Judge Ruby listened to Lloyd's testimony, these were the alleged facts from his account. Now, Rakie would get into a fight with Herbert Cunningham that day and lost. And just as he did after his previous fight at school, he left, but this time returning with Herbert Johnson. Herbert Johnson gave Rakie a gun and told him to shoot Herbert Cunningham. Lloyd claims he had left on the second shot, but heard many more as he was leaving. Based on that testimony, Ruby transferred the case to circuit court so Rakie could be tried as an adult. But that trial never occurred. Reason being, they noticed several inconsistencies with Lloyd's story. Lloyd said that the fight occurred at a basketball court, but there was no basketball court in the area. He also said that Herbert Cunningham was wearing shorts, but he actually died in a sweatsuit. So in turn, they didn't feel he was telling them the whole truth, or the truth at all for that matter. This could have easily been an orchestrated plan to keep the cops off of Rakie's trail by offering the wrong information on purpose. Now, Woody and his partner would actually search for this alleged basketball court in the city's poor neighborhoods, and they knew that a hoop could be anything from a crate to the rim of a bicycle tire nailed to a tree, which was all they expected to find, but they didn't find anything. It had been more than a year since the murder, so the DA ultimately decided not to prosecute. But after knowing this, I had to ask myself, who is Lloyd G? Well, from the information I've gathered on him, it said that back in January of '87, he would be 19 years old and living off the 2600 block of Glen Haven Avenue, and Herbert Cunningham was murdered in February of that same year, making the point that Lloyd had to have either heard of, known, or crossed paths with Rakie at some point, especially with his home being a walks away from the Blackwell projects, the place where Rakie spent most of his time. Now, 2 months after Rakie killed Herbert Cunningham, Lloyd G allegedly raped a 15-year-old girl on April 27th, being charged with the crime 2 days later. But without more details to that story, it's hard to say if this were a case of her parents pressing charges because they disapproved of their consensual relationship, or it was cut and dry, and Lloyd was in fact some perverted predator. That brings me to Lloyd's testimony. What if Lloyd testifying against Rakie was a way to either drop his own rape case or at the very least lessen the charge? He committed that rape 1 year before testifying, and as we know, detectives spent months investigating Rakie. So did they already have Lloyd's testimony as their smoking gun, letting it drag out until they found more evidence? Or maybe there were other charges Lloyd caught that detectives tried using against him. Either way, I say that because in later years, Lloyd would be charged in a botched robbery that ended with 2 of his accomplices being laid up in the hospital after. After making way to the spot they planned to rob, they bum rushed their way inside, but wouldn't make it past the point of the front door, because as Lloyd held a sawed-off shotgun on a teenage girl, her mother heard the noises and came running. Making it to the stairway, there was Lloyd, with the gun on her baby girl, and she didn't hesitate, firing 3 shots their way. Her boyfriend aside her then takes the pistol, firing 4 more times. Lloyd wasn't wounded, but it caused him to drop his weapon in the process, leaving it behind before fleeing away from the home. Now, of course, that situation itself has nothing to do with Rakie's murder case, but it proves that Lloyd G was knee deep in the streets the same as Rakie and the gang. But the big difference between him and Rakie, Lloyd had no qualms about being labeled a snitch. So after initially being arrested for Herbert's murder, he was released, just to be charged again on false evidence and dropped once more. So it's safe to say that Rakie was definitely one of their prime targets.
Blackwell was a public housing community built in 1970 in Southside Richmond. It quickly deteriorated due to its poverty-stricken and crime-plagued surroundings. The Hope 6 program was created to revitalize Blackwell, focusing on building up mixed-income communities rather than isolating poverty. However, the community was ultimately destroyed by poor planning and execution, and the word Blackwell became synonymous with failure.
We're in the spring season of 1988, and the weather in Richmond alone had the entire community of Blackwell outside today. Now for decades, the inner city had this ongoing trend. As it gets hotter, the city drops more bodies. And not because the heat brings out the worst in folks, but because everybody is outside now. You can bet that if the beef didn't see any bloodshed all winter, that you was going to bump into him at a cookout, house party, Chinese spot, or just posted outside your house. But in Richmond's case, nowhere was safe, not for civilians, or the guys who played in the street. And among those guys was someone who was heavy in the streets during the time. And he goes by the name Leslie McKay Braxton, aka Little Leslie. Just another guy from the neighborhood who hustled the same as others. He's characterized as a good dude overall, who never did anything to draw an attention or come across as threatening, but it wouldn't stop him from putting in his own work. Because on the day of April 28th, 1988, a 23-year-old man from Brooklyn, New York named Terrence Lawton was shot dead off the 1900 block of Genesee Road on the East End. Detectives would call it overkill as he was shot 13 times. Now Terrence's case wouldn't be solved until about 6 months later, and this is when the death of Leslie himself made witnesses feel it was safe to now come forward about who killed Terrence. But in between those 6 months, there would be another homicide that takes place just a week after. A homicide that traumatized the lives of 3 children who witnessed the entire thing. May 4th, 1988, a 36-year-old man by the name of Vincent Deans, aka Black Rick, had just picked up his nephew and niece along with their friend from a nearby store. A 6-year-old Doris Brown, 4-year-old Rashad Scott, and 3-year-old Jocelyn Brown. They were now on their way home, which was the 1500 block of Maury Street, inside the heart of Blackwell, also the same strip the Johnson and Brown gang operated and lived on. But Vincent would make a quick detour down an alleyway between the 15th and 16th streets. This was the alleyway directly behind the Browns' apartment. Now allegedly, there was another guy present in the vehicle named Raymond Hewlett Jr., who was sitting in the front passenger seat beside Vincent. And in later testimonies of Raymond and another man named Leon Smith, this would be their first-hand accounts of the following events. After Vincent pulled into the alleyway, he jumped out the car, leaving the engine running as he greeted a man standing nearby. The children were in the back seat talking with one another, totally unaware of the mere seconds before destruction. The man that Vincent greeted would smack a bag of cocaine in his hand, a way of disguising the handoff as a normal handshake. So Vincent, who's now back inside the car preparing to leave, was suddenly shot with the .357 Magnum, once in the chin, another in the shoulder, and 3 more to the back. Gunned down by Leon Smith, who was also in the alleyway when he pulled up. While Vincent's foot set on the gas pedal, his body went limp, forcing the car to speed off down the alley, then crashing into a few parked cars. Now Raymond, who still sat in the car, ducked inside the passenger seat until the gunfire ended. And all while the 3 children in the back seat cried out, Raymond would hurry out of the vehicle and flee the scene. The mother of one of the children, Rashad Scott, who's also Vincent's sister, was lying on the sofa when she heard a loud crash. Mrs. Scott lived literal seconds away from the alley that they were in, so she could hear her son Rashad crying out for her, as the sight of his deceased uncle terrified him. Arriving at the scene, she would see all the children outside the car, just screaming and running around. She then saw her brother inside the car, and she'd later say that blood was everywhere. It would be years before the true trigger man Leon Smith would admit to the crime while on a witness stand, snitching on the same people he put in work for. But before such time, he would spend majority of his time with Eugene Johnson. Wherever he goes, Leon goes, watching his back and on several occasions carrying out kill orders. so he acted as a bodyguard slash hitman of sorts, with it being said that Eugene was actually responsible for writing Vincent's death warrant. Another member of the gang was seen as the prime suspect in Vincent's murder, and that was Carlton Brown. In the following month, Carlton Brown was arrested on the 12th around 3:50 p.m. off of Boston and 15th Street. When Carlton was arrested, he had several weapons on his person, including a submachine gun Uzi and a .44 caliber pistol. That next morning, he was indicted for the murder, but shortly after this court appearance, he was acquitted. Because as we just covered, Leon Smith would be a big part on bringing down this entire operation, but that came with admitting everything he's done. One of those things being responsible for Vincent's murder. They beat that case using a lawyer named Jeffrey Everhart, which was the lawyer to have back in those days. Some would jokingly say that the man could beat a case even if the judge himself saw it happen. But Leon Smith wouldn't be the only one to turn state's witness. In the months to come, several guys revered as hood legends, real ones, or solid, broke one of the sacred codes of the streets, and that was snitching. Now Leon's deal was solely to survive the electric chair, which means that Leon would still have to serve life with the same guys he ends up selling out. Then just 5 days after Vincent's alleyway slaying, Carlton Brown's name was brought up in yet another murder. The murder of an 18-year-old man named Earl Orlando Hamlin, but this being a murder for hire case. Now he wouldn't be falsely accused or arrested for Vincent's murder until the month of June. So him paying for a kill order in between such time wasn't too far-fetched. It's said that Earl owed Carlton $600 worth of cocaine. There was a whole lot of talk going down in the streets, and allegedly Carlton would say if he saw Earl, he'd kill him himself. But if anybody else killed him, he'd give him $1,000. Carlton felt played or disrespected because Earl had made a grave mistake while dealing drugs for him. And now two friends of Earl's, 20-year-old John Thomas Jones and 21-year-old Apollo Lee Callahan, who claimed to be like brothers, would pick up his contract. Apollo himself lived a mere 3 blocks from Earl, while John lived off Jefferson Davis in a trailer park community. So while being the closest to Earl, Apollo would make their arrangements. As the night begins, Apollo and John would steal a car and pick Earl up shortly after. Both men strapped down with shotguns. Apollo then drove them all to the East End off of Ian's Lane. There seemed to be an argument between Earl and John about the stolen car. And while Apollo sat behind the wheel and John in the front passenger seat, he would turn to Earl, blasting him once in the chest and another blast to the thigh. After Earl's body was thrown out on the road, the two supposed friends sped off toward Oakwood Apartments that wasn't too far away. And here is where they stashed the shotguns inside of an apartment of someone that they knew. Immediately after, they parked the car in an unknown location, setting it ablaze in hopes of covering their tracks. Earl's body was found around 3 a.m., with his family being notified hours later. John and Apollo would show up to the morgue with Earl's family the following day, trying to distance themselves from the case by appearing to grieve for their late friend. And afterward, they called Carlton Brown while on the way back home from viewing the body. They inquired about the $1,000 that he promised for anyone willing to do the job. They made way to the 7-Eleven on Southside to meet Carlton. Upon meeting one another, Carlton allegedly gave John and Apollo $700 worth of cocaine instead of the $1,000 in cash like he promised. If the two killers had any problems with it, it wasn't expressed to the man known as Cotton, because he himself was just as, if not more dangerous than the men standing before him. Carlton would eventually be tried for the charge of murder for hire, but just as he beat the body in Vincent's murder, the same happened for Earl's. As for John and Apollo, they were arrested that same year. The same way they betrayed Earl in the streets, they'd eventually betray each other in the courts, with both men accusing the other of murdering their friend, and both would be sentenced to life in prison. We checked back in with Rocky Cloyd a week and a half later on the day of May 20th of 1988. On this day, Rakie appeared in court regarding the murder of Herbert Cunningham, where the judge would drop any and all charges against him. And Lloyd G's contradictory testimony played the biggest part of that. Rocky Cloyd was clean-shaven and soft-spoken throughout the court hearings as he hung his head. But that face and those eyes were emotionless. The defense would express their feelings toward the mother-son dynamic by saying, and I quote, "It's not that Miss Taylor didn't try to control him, because she's here in court, front and center, fighting for her son. They thought that maybe the kid could be turned around. Maybe he wasn't the killing machine that they all thought. Rakie's lawyer for the Cunningham case had 3 series of private interviews with him in the city detention home, and he would give him the game on lawyer-client confidentiality, reminding Rakie that whatever he told him would remain a secret. He had nothing to hide with him, but still, Rakie denied having ever killed anyone. John would say Rakie could have told him that he killed 5 people and he wouldn't have revealed a word of it. But he steadily maintained his innocence in this particular case, and any before or after, denying being involved in any of it. But before Rakie was formally released, the judge, he warned Rakie with a sense of urgency, saying, and I quote, "I'm warning you, young man, if you keep heading down this wrong road, you yourself will be dead soon." And Rakie, with a silent expression, nodded to the judge and received his walking papers. Now in this moment, you wonder if Rakie really took heed to those words, but in all actuality, he would carry on as if nothing had changed. Almost 3 weeks later, after being released from the detention center, Rakie's back at home with his mom, who is planning to move soon, and Rakie himself has a legit 9-to-5 job now. The date is June 9th, and his probation counselor paid him a visit to see how much progress he's made, if any at all, and he was surprised and proud to see Rakie trying to do things a bit different. For those on the outside who may not know Rakie, it'll look all but the same to you. Just another way to throw off the people who had power to put him back inside. If we remember, all he's ever wanted was to feel loved, be heard, and be closer with his mom. A child at his age with that kind of pain, you can consider this very moment as Rakie's crossroad. And whichever road he chose would define who he'd eventually become. But having one foot inside mama's house and one foot out on the streets kept him tethered to something that he himself didn't fully respect 100%. And it was some of the older guys who painted that perspective for him, and the person who would be considered his boss, Eugene Johnson, which he would have the least bit of respect for. Nevertheless, the street element provided things that the home never could. So in turn, Rocky Cloyd made his choice, because allegedly, 2 days later, on June 11, 1988, a 25-year-old man by the name of Anthony Greg Mallory would allegedly become the 5th victim of the fierce Rakie. But as it was for majority of the people Rakie was accused of laying down, there was no evidence or hard proof, just talk, word of mouth from the streets. This was a time where you not only wanted a lot of people to know that you'll bust your gun, but you needed the right people to know you ain't to be played with. Rakie was feared, but no one could definitively prove he'd ever done a thing. A month and 10 days exact would pass by, and the date is July 21st, 1988. Rakie and his mother went to Harris's office to report that they had moved off the 2800 block of Broad Rock Boulevard. Rakie also informed him that he had to appear in court that day because he had been charged with reckless driving and driving a motorcycle without a license. He said that from his perspective, the motorcycle was a motorbike and did not require a license. Later that day, Rakie was found guilty of reckless driving and was given a fine, while the other charge was dismissed. Harris would say that during the coming months, he hoped to prepare Rakie for termination of court supervision, because after all, in September, Rakie would be 18 years old, and the juvenile system would lose all jurisdiction. His mother Barbara had no current concerns or problems in their new home adjustment, and appears to be more confident and closer in her relationship to him. And just 4 days later, a police officer had charged Rakie with going 45 miles per hour in a 25 miles per hour zone. The car he was driving was a 1978 Cadillac 4-door sedan, and it was found out to be registered to Carlton, Brown. So there was no doubt he still hung around the street element that he promised his mom and the courts to leave alone. But 2 days later, the city's homicide total for 1988 grew by 2 that night, with police discovering 2 men who were killed within an hour of each other. Both were in South Richmond, but unrelated. Shortly after 10 p.m., a man named Tony Howard returned to his family's home at 201 West 34th Street and found the body of his 40-year-old father, Anthony Howard Sr., in the kitchen. His hands had been tied behind his back with a gunshot wound to the back of his head. So as police were investigating Anthony's murder, several officials rushed from West 34th Street off of 901 Maury Street. It was about 11 p.m. when they received the report of a shooting, and it was 30-year-old Richard E. Hill who lived at the address. He had been shot in the head and was lying on the ground near his stoop. His distraught mother, who found his body, would be the one to call the police. At the time, police had no motive or suspects in Richard's shooting, but as always, there were whispers, rumors, speculation with Rakie's name spoken along with them. If Rakie indeed was the doer, this would be his 6th and final body, one less than the 7 bodies that all the papers claim he had. So again, if this is true, and he is the trigger man for all 6 murders, it was because of Rakie's quiet nature that he was able to maneuver in the streets as a ghost for so long. But only the people who knew not to play with Rakie, while everyone else who didn't would see him as harmless at first glance. But while Rakie seemed to be at his peak in the streets, bringing in thousands of dollars hustling, having his own car, jewelry, and more importantly, the respect and fear from the streets, his 4-year-long spree would come to an end before he could reach his 18th birthday. At 11:15 p.m. the next day, Rakie, who was draped in his gray Adidas tracksuit, 2 gold rings and gold bracelet, was down Blackwell like any other night. But this night, he was at a payphone at the intersection of East 15th and 16th Street off of Dinwiddie Avenue. Now at this point in Rakie's life, he knew he was a target in the street because he had put in too much work not to be. So having a gun was a part of his wardrobe. But just having it did him no good this go around, because someone would spot Rakie. Throwing shots his way, he was struck twice in the back. Fleeing away from the payphone, he stumbled into a nearby alleyway. The more he ran, the more blood he lose. And after just a few feet inside the alley, he hit the ground. A nearby neighbor reported the shooting after the shots went off, but he'd eventually succumb to his gunshot wounds before police and ambulance could arrive. There was a girl named Phyllis who lived in an apartment connected to the alley. She would see Rakie take his last breath, watching from her open back door. Another friend of Rakie's, who were referred to as Dion, would get there within 10 seconds after the shooting. Seeing that Phyllis was already there, he'd say she looked overwhelmingly shocked, her mouth wide open, frozen in place. It was clear that she had seen something she would rather forget. Now, was this an enemy from the Flax family? A hurt family member from one of Rakie's past victims? Somebody who feared Rakie enough to kill him? Or just some random guy who was filled with so much hate and jealousy toward Rakie, he felt he had to take his life? There were a gang of questions, but far as the who and why would die with the person responsible for his death. As the night grew later, Detective Woody would be on scene, looking at the kid they'd been after for months. Police covered his body with a sheet, and moments later, his mother pulls up to the scene, stood nearby convulsing and screaming, "Don't take me away from my Rakie," over and over, as she had to be held back from her son's body by bystanders. An officer who stood by would say that in the 6,534 days of Rakie's life, he had grown into one of the most notorious murderers in Richmond. After Rakie passed away, Eugene would later say in a prison interview that he was like a little brother to him, as he was for a lot of older guys he hung with. A high-profile case like Rakie's had multiple reporters looking for interviews from his family. And just a day after he was murdered, Rakie's family told the Richmond Times-Dispatch that Rakie was a nice person who excelled at things like football and basketball. He wasn't with the bad crowd of people. His mother Barbara, in an effort to prove her son's innocence of selling drugs, would say verbatim, "I wouldn't be living in a poor neighborhood if my son had been a drug dealer." And maybe she wouldn't realize her own statement in the heat of the moment, but it all but alluded to her not only benefiting from her son's alleged drug dealings, but it also means she would be complicit in him doing so if she knew that he did. She went on to say that they were trying to make her son out to be a monster or an animal, further saying, and I quote, "I don't care. I know the kind of person my son was, a loving person." Now the same day, Rakie's probation counselor Harris will write in his very last entry in his log that tracked Rakie's progress. It read as followed: "Death notice. On this date, I, Rakie's probation counselor, heard on the news and read in the paper that a youth shot to death last night was identified as Rocky Cloyd. This case will now be closed if this youth is confirmed to be Rakie." Later in the report, he wrote that Rakie's community adjustment had been good, but in separate notes, his supervisor and that supervisor disagreed, solely basing their opinions on what the police had to say about Rakie since his death, which were all but positive things. While Harris, he would portray the last few months of Rakie's life alive as him trying to stay out of trouble. He was sleeping at home, obeying his mother, and he seemed to be giving up his friends. But it's clear that there were two perspectives of this young man, but it was hardly believed that both perspectives were one and the same. Meaning, while being loving, quiet, and soft-spoken, he was also vicious when he needed to be. The detectives over the case would say the autopsy showed that Rakie was wearing signs of what they called the connection. And that was because of the items that was now considered Rakie's special effects, which was a gold bracelet, 2 gold rings, and a gold tooth. The connection was described as being the bridge between young kids and the older street guys, which enticed said kids to want to live the same lifestyle as them. Now Ruby, the judge who for almost 5 years had seen Rakie make his way through the juvenile system, had dismissed Rakie's last case, which was the traffic ticket. And what remained was a pile of paper showing again that the system hadn't worked. It happens about 10 times a year, and usually he finds out by scanning the paper and seeing a familiar teenager's face. A face that had to appear before him several times has either been killed or arrested for a killing. Judge Ruby's last words on the matter of Rakie would be this: the rejection, the gold, the guns, the drugs, the peer pressure, the lack of discipline, guidance and hope, and the problems in the judicial process itself, they're beating the efforts to reform the Rocky Cloyds of the city. We failed. Our job is to reform them, but the kid is dead, and that means we failed. Some would say Rakie's reputation and recent death made it very easy for police to pin almost 24 murders under his name. That number would drop to 21, then to 10, with a definite number of 7 or 6 murders they were sure he was the trigger man for. In some murders they paint the picture of Rakie even giving the orders to kill, and the rest was with him just being present. So after years of working as a hitman, or police thinking he was, Rakie's deeds caught up with him in the same place he did majority of his dirt. Until this current day, nobody has been charged for Rakie's murder. And I myself had a close friend of Rakie's tell me personally that he had never killed anyone. But that truth alone will forever be with the person that Richmond dubbed the teenage hitman. And rest in peace, Rocky Cloyd. The message I'm leaving with the people today is more so to the parents. And this is no disrespect toward Miss Barbara Taylor, Rakie's mother. Regardless of the information provided by the articles, we don't know the real story behind her parenting when that door closed at the end of the day. But going off the info we do have, either that be 100% true or half right. Children will always learn from the home first. Whatever home that may be, 2-parent, 1-parent, foster care, or otherwise. Parents and guardians are responsible for the foundation of said child. Not all children with a weak foundation fall short in life, but you can bet that that weak foundation inside a poor environment is almost guaranteed to fall apart. And we have very few exceptions of the rule. You know, that rapper who came from nothing and made it big. You know, that ball player who stumbled upon a coach who actually cared about his talent. It ain't many people out here with the horror story of a Rakie who's now living happily ever after. But let me tell you something. That father who left the child because he left the mom can create that horror story. That mother who took her pain and anger out on the child can create that horror story. What we do next week, tomorrow, today will greatly affect our children for the next 10 years. But if the environment is bad and the outside influence is bad and even the schools is bad, that home needs to be the strongest force in that child's life. He's gonna have more than one influence pulling him in the same direction of destruction. So yes, you have to be present, assuring, loving, protecting, understanding, and one of the more important things, attentive. All those things would have made a big difference in Rocky Cloyd's life. Because if he was the hitman like they say, maybe those who lost their lives to Rakie's gun would still be here. Or maybe not. But rest in peace to all the fallen, and y'all stay safe out there.
Hood legend, yeah, these the realest words I was spit on wax. Boog in the hood, I crawl through the crevices and I slip through the cracks. I live through the earls of the browns and flax. Live through the earls of the main, the range, Rockies and the Marcanes. Soldiers like Becker changed the game. It's like Smitty with his dump truck. Soldiers like Fish Finger Cluck Cluck. Murder Prince was cold-blooded. Richmond Rain was so flooded. Turn the faucet on. Riley boys, hardly calls.
Now yes, Rakie's story officially ends here, being forever 17. But the Johnson family, the Brown family, and the Flax family stories are all still ongoing. So when we come back, we'll pick back up after the murder for hire contract on Earl Hamlin's life. A murder that Carlton Brown was initially accused of, but was acquitted after Leon Smith's damning testimony later in the year. And by this time, all key players but one are still on the streets, and that's Reginald Johnson. But the time in which the others would face their fate wasn't too far behind.